Fort Worth, Texas, woke up to the kind of September morning that felt almost scripted for a wedding. The sky stretched wide and blue over the city, the air warm but not yet heavy, and the early sunlight spilled across manicured lawns like someone had dialed up the saturation. On the quiet, tree-lined street where the Calloway family lived, parked cars were already starting to line the curbs, their chrome catching the light. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's sprinkler ticked back and forth, a slow rhythm to an otherwise electric kind of day. Inside the Calloway home, the scent of fresh lilies and polished wood drifted through the open windows. A catering van idled out front, its back doors swinging open to reveal trays of champagne flutes and silver platters covered in linen. Every detail, every ribbon, every flower arrangement looked like it had been pulled straight from a bridal magazine. And in a way it had. Patricia Calloway wouldn't have had it any other way. At 58, with her perfectly coiffed hair and that quiet air of authority that made people stand a little straighter when she entered a room, Patricia was the kind of woman who knew how to orchestrate an image. Today wasn't just her son's wedding. It was a statement, the culmination of decades of careful control. Ethan Calloway, the groom, had inherited some of that polish, though in a looser, more effortless way. At 29, he was the sort of man people called steady, someone who carried himself with an easy charm that could win over anyone from a first date to a skeptical client. He ran his own small but thriving real estate firm, and his engagement to Tiana Brooks had been the talk of Fort Worth's social circle for months. She was stunning, a high school counselor with a warm laugh, the kind of woman whose presence could light up a room. Together, they looked like the sort of couple you'd see on the cover of a wedding brochure. In the Calloway living room, a suit bag hung on the back of a chair, its zipper halfway open to reveal the crisp black tuxedo Ethan would wear in just a few hours. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, while Patricia hovered nearby, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from his shirt sleeve. Her eyes lingered on him in a way that was equal parts pride and something else, something harder to read. "You're going to make a handsome groom," she said, her voice low but deliberate. Ethan smiled, though his gaze flickered past her toward the doorway, where Marcus Calloway had just stepped in. The Reverend Marcus, as most people called him, was Patricia's younger brother by 3 years. He carried himself with the calm assurance of someone used to speaking from a pulpit, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes steady. His tailored charcoal suit looked almost ceremonial, and his presence here today felt natural. He'd be officiating the ceremony, a family touch that everyone agreed made the day more special. Marcus clasped Ethan's shoulder warmly. "Big day," he said, his deep voice carrying that smooth preacher's cadence. "You ready for it?" "More than ready," Ethan replied, though something in his tone carried a flicker of distraction. If anyone else noticed it, they didn't say so. Outside, a photographer was already snapping candid shots of the arriving guests. Laughing cousins in pastel dresses, old friend from college, coworkers in press suits. The energy was building, that pre-ceremony buzz where everyone's talking over each other, sharing predictions about how emotional the vows will be, or whispering about who's sitting next to whom at the reception. Down the street, the church stood gleaming white against the Texas sky, its stained glass windows winking with morning light. Rows of folding chairs have been set up on the lawn for the outdoor portion of the celebration, each one tied with satin bows that fluttered in the breeze. The florist van was parked nearby, and 2 women in aprons were adjusting centerpieces heavy with roses and hydrangeas. Somewhere a string quartet was tuning up, the notes drifting faintly on the wind. It should have felt perfect, and on the surface it did. But beneath the crisp edges of the day, there was a subtle undercurrent, a tension that didn't belong at a wedding. It wasn't visible in the flowers or the music or the perfect weather, but in the way Patricia's eyes occasionally darted toward Ethan, studying him like she was trying to read his mind. In the way Ethan's smile sometimes lingered just a fraction too long, as if holding something back. And in the way Marcus, usually unshakable, seemed to avoid meeting Ethan's gaze for too long a stretch. At the Brooks family home across town, Tiana stood in front of her own mirror, the lace bodice of her gown hugging her figure as her bridesmaids fussed over her veil. Her mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, telling anyone who would listen that she'd never seen her daughter look more beautiful. In her heart, Tiana believed this was the happiest day of her life. She had no idea that across town, in the Calloway house, the air between her fiancé and his family had thickened into something fragile, something sharp. As the morning wore on, the clock hands crept closer to the ceremony. The final touches fell into place. The champagne chilled, the chairs aligned, the program stacked in neat rows. Guests began filing into the church, their chatter rising in soft waves. From the outside, it looked like a flawless Texas wedding morning, the kind of event that would be remembered for its beauty, its elegance, its sense of community. No one could have guessed that before the day was over, the Calloway name would be on every news station in the state. That what began under the blessing of family and faith would end in blood and chaos. For now, the sun was still shining, the music still playing, and the smile still genuine. But somewhere beneath all the polished surfaces and pretty details, the first shadow was already creeping in, and it was only a matter of hours before it swallowed everything. The Calloway house had been in the family for decades, its bones older than Patricia herself. It wasn't grand in the way of magazine spreads or real estate listings, but it carried the weight of history. Creaking floorboards, paint worn thin on the banister, the faint scent of cedar and dust that never seemed to leave. Ethan had grown up here, running up and down those same stairs, hiding in the closets during hide-and-seek, listening to summer storms. Drum against the roof from his bedroom window. But the basement had always been Patricia's domain. It wasn't a finished space. The concrete floor was uneven, cold to the touch, and the single bulb hanging from the low ceiling threw more shadows than light. Patricia kept it organized in her way. Rows of labeled boxes stacked against the far wall, shelves lined with canned goods, a few dusty holiday decorations in plastic bins. Ethan had only been down here a handful of times since moving out, usually to help carry something heavy for his mother. But that morning, while Patricia was busy making last-minute calls to vendors, Ethan had a different purpose. He'd come for the toolbox. One of the groomsmen had managed to snap the clasp on a decorative stand at the reception hall the night before, and Ethan figured he could fix it in minutes if he could just find his old set of screwdrivers. He ducked down the basement stairs 2 at a time, the cool air hitting him in the face like a different season altogether. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. His eyes scanned the shelves until they landed on a row of paint cans pushed against the far wall. That's when he noticed something odd. One of the wooden shelves had shifted slightly, just enough to leave a sliver of darkness along the wall behind it. He frowned. That shelf had always been flush with the wall. Curiosity overrode the original errand. Ethan reached out, his fingers curling around the edge of the shelf. It was heavier than he expected, the weight of old books and stacked boxes fighting him. But after a moment of straining, it scraped forward just enough for him to see what was behind it. A narrow cavity in the wall, maybe 3 feet high, lined with the same old cedar planks that framed the rest of the basement. Inside, tucked away like something deliberately hidden, was a small wooden box. It was simple, no lock, no hinges, just smooth sides and a sliding lid. The kind of box you might keep postcards in or old jewelry. But it was the dust on it that caught Ethan's attention, a thick layer undisturbed for years. He slid it out carefully, feeling the surprising weight of it, and set it on the workbench under the hanging bulb. The lid groaned softly as he pushed it open. Inside were bundles of paper tied with faded ribbon. On top sat an envelope with his name written in a looping, elegant script. His full name, Ethan Marcus Calloway, the middle name suddenly striking him as strange. His mother never used it. He never used it. He set the envelope aside and lifted the first bundle. Letters. Handwritten, dated from the late 90s and early 2000s, all signed him. He unfolded one, scanning the first few lines, and his stomach tightened. They weren't business letters or casual notes. They were intimate, raw, lines about longing, about secret meetings, about a love that could never be spoken aloud. And every single one was addressed to P. He flipped through them faster, the words blurring together until he found a signature. Marcus. Reverend Marcus Calloway. His uncle. Ethan sat down hard on the workbench stool. Under the letters were official documents. His birth certificate, the familiar raised seal of the Texas Department of State Health Services, pressed into the corner. But where the father's name should have read David Calloway, it had been typed over, clumsily corrected to Marcus Calloway. And beneath that, tucked into a manila folder, was something even worse, a laboratory printout with DNA markers, the kind he'd seen on TV crime shows. It left no room for interpretation. Marcus was his biological father. His hand shook as he dug deeper into the box. At the very bottom was a thick packet of photocopied police reports dated June 2005. He scanned the first page, case file on the death of David Calloway. The official cause listed as suicide by hanging. But then came the photographs, the rope, the overturned chair, the bruising patterns on the neck. And stapled to the last page was a handwritten note in a familiar script, Patricia's handwriting. It read, "They'll never believe it was anything else." Ethan's vision tunneled, the edges of the room going soft. The basement felt colder now, like the air itself had shifted. His mind scrambled to make sense of it. Patricia, Marcus, the affair, the murder of the man he'd called his father for 24 years. It was too much, layered on too quickly, and yet something deep inside him said this explained everything. The way Patricia and Marcus exchanged glances at family gatherings, the quiet tension that always seemed to hum under the surface of their household, the way Patricia never spoke much about David unless pressed. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the open box, until the hum of the refrigerator upstairs snapped him back. He grabbed his phone from his pocket, took quick photos of everything, every document, every letter, the birth certificate, the DNA results. Evidence. He didn't know what he'd do with it yet, but he knew he couldn't let it disappear back into the wall. A floorboard creaked above him. "Ethan," Patricia's voice floated down the stairs. "You down there?" He shoved the papers back into the box, slid it under the workbench for the moment, and stepped toward the bottom of the stairs. "Yeah, just looking for the toolbox," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. Patricia appeared at the top of the steps, her silhouette framed by the brighter light upstairs. She was holding her phone, but her eyes were sharp, scanning him in a way that made his skin prickle. "We gotta leave in 10 minutes. Don't be late," she said, her tone clipped. "Right. Be right up," he replied. She lingered a second longer before disappearing. Ethan exhaled slowly, his pulse hammering. Whatever this was, this twisted, 30-year knot of secrets, it had just landed in his lap hours before the most important day of his life. And the longer he thought about it, the more certain he became. He couldn't go through with the wedding without telling the truth. Not just to Tiana, but to everyone. He looked back at the box under the workbench, that unassuming little rectangle of wood, and felt the decision harden inside him. This was going to end today, one way or another. The ride to the church was supposed to be a quiet, reflective moment for Ethan, a chance to settle his nerves before the ceremony, maybe run through his vows in his head. Instead, his chest felt tight, like every breath was fighting through barbed wire. The discovery in the basement hadn't left him for a second. The box, the letters, the DNA report, the police files. It all played over in his mind like a fever dream, looping until the heat in his blood burned hotter than the Texas sun beating down outside. By the time he stepped out of the car in the church parking lot, his decision was already made. He wasn't going to carry this secret a single day longer. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the hum of soft conversation echoing off the high ceilings. Guests were taking their seats, smiling, waving, flipping through the ceremony programs. The string quartet was playing something light and delicate, but Ethan barely heard it. His eyes locked on one person across the aisle, Patricia. She was radiant in a pale blue dress, hair swept back into a perfect chignon, a pearl necklace resting at her collarbone. She looked every inch the proud mother of the groom. But when her gaze met Ethan's, something shifted. The pride vanished, replaced by that same sharp, calculating glint he'd seen at the top of the basement stairs. He didn't give her time to move. Striding across the aisle, he caught her by the arm and guided her into a side hallway, away from the guests' curious eyes. The moment they were alone, the mask slipped. "What the hell is this?" Ethan hissed, shoving his phone toward her. The screen displayed a photo of the DNA test. Marcus's name printed clear as day. He swiped. Images of the letters, the birth certificate, the police reports. "Explain." "Now." Patricia's eyes flicked over the screen, but her expression stayed almost eerily calm. "Where did you find that?" "Don't play dumb." "In the basement behind the shelf." "Tell me it's not true." A bead of silence stretched between them, thick as wet cement. Then Patricia sighed, slow, measured, like she'd just been handed a task she'd been dreading for years. "It's true," she said quietly. Ethan's stomach turned. "You slept with your own brother. You had me with him. And then you killed Dad to keep it quiet." Her jaw tightened. David was going to ruin everything. He found out, and he couldn't live with it, or let me live with it. It was complicated. "No," Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "It's not complicated. It's sick, and you've been lying to me my entire life." Patricia's eyes narrowed, the warmth draining out completely. "You think you know what's best? You think the world needs to hear this? You have no idea what kind of damage you'll do. To yourself, to Tiana, to every single person sitting out there." "I don't care," Ethan said, his voice low but hard. "I'm not living with your lies. When I'm standing up there in front of everyone, I'm going to tell them exactly who you are and what you did." Patricia stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the confined hallway. "If you say one word, Ethan, you won't just be destroying me. You'll be destroying yourself. People will see you as the product of something filthy. You'll be marked forever. I'd rather be marked with the truth than live under your dirt." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of fear quickly buried under steel. "You're making a mistake. I'm making the only choice I can live with." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Reverend Marcus appeared, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. He froze when he saw them, reading the tension instantly. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice even, but his eyes shifting between mother and son. Ethan turned to him, the fury in his veins reigniting. "Why don't you tell me, Marcus? Or should I call you Dad?" Marcus's face went pale, the color draining so fast, it was like someone had pulled the plug. "Ethan, don't!" Ethan snapped. "You knew. All these years, you knew, and you stood there at birthdays and graduations and pretended to be my uncle." Marcus took a cautious step closer. "It wasn't my choice to hide it. Your mother. My mother killed the man who raised me. Ethan cut in, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. And you? You just let her. You were both fine letting me live a lie. Patricia's voice sliced through the air. Enough. This conversation ends here. No, Ethan said, turning back to her. This conversation is just getting started. And it's going to end on that altar in front of every guest, with me telling them everything you've done. Marcus reached out a hand, like he could physically pull the words back. Ethan, think about what you're saying. Once it's out there, you can't take it back. That's the point, Ethan said. Patricia's eyes locked on him, unblinking cold. If you do this, you'll regret it. I promise you. Ethan stepped back, shoving his phone into his pocket. The only thing I regret is not finding out sooner. The three of them stood there in a brittle, dangerous silence, the kind that could shatter with the smallest sound. Then a voice called from the main hall, one of the groomsmen, telling Ethan it was time to line up. Ethan brushed past them, his pulse pounding in his ears. He didn't look back. Behind him, Patricia and Marcus exchanged a glance. Marcus's brow furrowed with unease, but Patricia's face was unreadable, except for the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, a movement so small it could have been nothing, or it could have been the first shadow of a plan forming. As Ethan stepped into the doorway leading toward the aisle, the music swelled, and the guests rose to their feet. All he could think about was the microphone that would be in his hand in less than an hour, and the truth he was going to drop like a live grenade in the middle of his perfect wedding. He didn't know it yet, but Patricia was already deciding how to make sure that moment never came. The late morning sun turned the white steeple of St. Matthew's Church into a spear of light, cutting into the Texas sky. By the time the guests had all taken their seats, the air outside shimmered with heat, but inside, the sanctuary was cool and fragrant with a heady mix of roses, lilies, and polished oak. From the back of the church, Ethan stood in the narrow corridor just beyond the double doors, his hands flexing open and closed. The low murmur of voices from the pews carried like an undercurrent beneath the music from the string quartet. Somewhere beyond those doors, Tiana was making her final adjustments before the walk down the aisle. He could feel the phone in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the pictures and documents waiting there. His heartbeat wasn't in sync with the music. It was fast, restless, drumming against his ribs. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that box again, smelled the dust of the basement, heard Patricia's voice saying it's true. The organ swelled, and the crowd's chatter dropped to a whisper. The groomsmen began their slow procession up the aisle. Ethan followed them in, each step measured, deliberate. The church seemed brighter than usual, every stained glass panel catching the sunlight just right. At the altar, Marcus stood waiting, his expression a carefully crafted mask of serenity. But when their eyes met, Ethan caught a flash of unease there, quick, but enough to confirm Marcus knew exactly what might be coming. The music shifted, and the congregation rose. The back doors opened, revealing Tiana framed in white, her veil trailing behind her, the sunlight turning her gown into something almost unreal. For a moment, Ethan's breath caught, not because the tension had faded, but because she was still the woman he loved, even with the storm he was about to unleash. She reached the altar, and Marcus began the ceremony, his preacher's cadence smooth and steady. Ethan barely heard the words. His focus was on a microphone resting on the podium, a foot away. His chance. When Marcus paused for the exchange of vows, Ethan stepped forward. Before we go any further, he said, his voice carrying easily through the sound system, I need to tell everyone something. A ripple of murmurs moved through the pews. Tiana looked at him in confusion. Marcus's eyes widened just enough for Ethan to notice. Patricia, seated in the front row, didn't move. This isn't going to be a normal wedding speech, Ethan continued. Because for 29 years, I've been living a lie, one my own family made sure I never discovered. Until now. He reached into his pocket for the phone. In the front row, Patricia's hand dipped into the clutch resting on her lap. The move was so smooth, so practiced, that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Ethan did, just in time to see the flash of black metal. "Mom, what are you?" The first shot cracked through the sanctuary like a thunderclap. Gasps turned to screams as Ethan staggered back, the phone slipping from his hand, clattering across the wooden floor. His knees buckled, a red bloom spreading across the front of his white shirt. Chaos erupted instantly. Guests ducked behind pews. The string quartet stopped mid-note. Someone shouted for 911. Marcus froze in place, shock washing over his face. Patricia stood now, the gun steady in her grip, her expression cold, almost detached. She didn't look at the guests or at Marcus. Her eyes were locked on Ethan as he lay on the altar steps, gasping, blood pooling beneath him. "You don't get to destroy me," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the panic. Two men from the audience lunged toward her, but she didn't resist when they grabbed her arms and forced the gun from her hand. The weapon clattered onto the hardwood floor, the sound hollow in the stunned silence that followed. Tiana dropped to her knees beside Ethan, pressing her hands against his chest, her dress staining red almost instantly. "Stay with me," she kept saying, her voice breaking. "Stay with me, baby." Ethan's eyes fluttered open once, finding hers. His lips moved, forming a word. Maybe sorry, maybe truth, before his head fell back against the step. The police arrived within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights staining the church's white walls. Paramedics rushed forward, working quickly, but the look on one medic's face told everyone the outcome before the words were spoken. Ethan Calloway was pronounced dead at the scene. Patricia, hands cuffed behind her back, was led past rows of horrified guests. Some turned away, others stared openly, disbelief etched into their faces. She didn't cry. She didn't look at anyone. Only once did she glance over her shoulder, at the altar at the spot where her son had fallen, before stepping into the blinding daylight outside. The sound of the church doors slamming shut echoed, like the final note of a hymn no one wanted to hear. Inside, the flowers still looked perfect, the music sheets still sat on their stands, and the programs were still neatly stacked at the back. But the wedding was over, replaced by a crime scene that would haunt everyone who had been there for the rest of their lives. The church was still heavy with the scent of flowers when the police sealed it off, but the air had shifted, thick now with the metallic tang of blood and the low hum of radios crackling in the hands of uniformed officers. Guests, shaken and pale, were escorted out in small groups, their formal clothes wrinkled from crouching behind pews, their voices hushed as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever was left of the morning. Detective Laura Martinez, a veteran with the Fort Worth PD, stepped over the yellow tape at the main entrance, her eyes sweeping the scene in practiced arcs. At the front of the sanctuary, crime scene techs were photographing the blood-stained steps leading to the altar, the discarded microphone, and the phone that had skidded several feet from where Ethan had fallen. She didn't need a degree in forensics to know the phone was important. The screen was still lit, frozen on a photograph of a DNA report. Paramedics had already wheeled Ethan's body out under a white sheet, but the crimson stain left behind on the altar steps was impossible to ignore. The image was sharp in Laura's mind, even as she turned toward the front pew, where Patricia Calloway sat, cuffed, her hands resting calmly in her lap, like she was waiting for a church service to resume. "You're under arrest for the murder of your son," the arresting officer had told her minutes earlier, but Patricia hadn't flinched. Now, Her gaze was fixed on the stained glass window above the altar, her expression unreadable. Marcus Calloway, still in his preacher's robe, hovered a few feet away, pale and trembling. When Laura approached him, he didn't wait for her to ask. I didn't know she would do that," he stammered. God help me. I thought she was just going to talk to him." Laura's voice was calm but firm. "Reverend, you're going to need to come with me to the station. We have some questions about your relationship with Patricia and about Ethan's father." Marcus's eyes flicked toward Patricia, but she didn't look back. His lips parted, then closed again, like he was trying to decide which lie would sound most believable. Back at the Fort Worth Police Department, the interviews began. Patricia was led into an interrogation room. Sterile, quiet, the hum of the fluorescent light overhead filling the spaces between questions. She sat with her back straight, hands folded neatly in front of her, as if she were at a tea party instead of under suspicion for murder. Detective Martinez laid out the photos taken from Ethan's phone. The DNA test naming Marcus as the biological father, the love letters, the altered birth certificate, the police reports from 2005 detailing David Calloway's death. Patricia glanced at them once, then returned her gaze to Martinez. "My son was going to destroy our family in front of 200 people," she said evenly. "I couldn't let that happen." "You're admitting you killed him," Martinez said. "I'm admitting I protected what mattered," Patricia replied. "There's a difference." When asked about David's death, Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "David wasn't the man everyone thought he was," she said. "He knew about Marcus and me. He threatened to take Ethan away, to ruin both of us. I stopped him before he could." Meanwhile, in another room, Marcus was unraveling. Faced with the same stack of evidence, his voice shook. "I didn't kill David," he insisted. "Patricia, she called me that night, said there had been an argument, said David was dead. I came over, and she asked me to help her make it look like a suicide. I should have gone to the police, but..." His voice cracked. "But I was scared. I loved her. I loved Ethan. I thought I was protecting him." The picture was becoming painfully clear. An incestuous relationship between brother and sister, a murder disguised as suicide, a child raised under a false identity, and 30 years of silence maintained through fear and control. Digital forensics confirmed that the documents on Ethan's phone matched the originals found in Patricia's basement, hidden behind a shelf. The letters were analyzed for handwriting, matched conclusively to both Patricia and Marcus. The police reports from 2005 bore a suppressed note from the original investigator, suggesting inconsistencies in the hanging evidence. Notes that had never been pursued, possibly due to Patricia's influence in the community at the time. Witnesses from the wedding, including Tiana, corroborated the hallway confrontation between Ethan and his mother before the ceremony. One groomsman admitted overhearing Ethan tell a friend, "I'm going to tell them the truth today. All of it." The final nail came when forensic ballistics confirmed the handgun Patricia used in the church was registered to her. Gunshot residue tests on her hands came back positive. There was no question she had fired the fatal shot in front of hundreds with deliberate intent. When news of the arrest broke, Fort Worth lit up with chatter. Social media exploded with clips from shaken guests who had filmed moments after the shooting. Headlines screamed about the wedding day murder and the Calloway family secrets. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, digging through public records, interviewing anyone who had ever known the family. In the community, the reactions were split, some stunned into silence, others claiming they'd always felt something was off about the Calloways. Church members whispered about Marcus, wondering how a man who had preached every Sunday could carry such a sin in his heart. Within a week, both Patricia and Marcus were formally charged. Patricia with first-degree murder and the 2005 murder of David Calloway. Marcus with incest and being an accessory after the fact in David's death. In the middle of it all was Tiana, blindsided by grief and betrayal. She sat through hours of interviews with detectives, her hands twisting in her lap, describing Ethan's shock the night before when he'd found the box. "He said he couldn't marry me without telling the truth," she whispered. "He said it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone living with lies." By the end of the investigation, there was no mystery left, just the ugly truth documented in evidence bags and sworn statements. What had happened at the altar wasn't a moment of madness. It was the final act in a decades-long cover-up, a desperate attempt to keep the past buried, even if it meant pulling the trigger on the future. Patricia hadn't just killed her son. She'd killed the last thread holding her family's image together. And Fort Worth would never forget the day a wedding became a crime scene. The courthouse in downtown Fort Worth had seen its share of high-profile cases, but nothing in recent memory compared to the media circus that descended for State of Texas versus Patricia Calloway. For weeks, the front steps were lined with news vans, camera crews, and onlookers pressed up against metal barricades, hoping for a glimpse of the woman now infamous as the wedding day killer. On the first morning of the trial, Patricia arrived flanked by deputies, dressed in a navy blazer and crisp white blouse, her silver hair pulled back in a low twist. She walked with the same upright posture she had at Ethan's wedding, chin lifted, eyes scanning the crowd like she was daring anyone to speak her name out loud. The crowd obliged anyway, some shouting "murderer," while others simply stared, phones raised. Inside, the gallery was packed, family members, reporters, church congregants, curious locals. Every seat was taken, and still people lined the walls in the back. The judge, a stern woman named Claire Hightower, called the court to order, her gavel cracking through the murmurs. The prosecution wasted no time. Assistant District Attorney Renee Walters stood before the jury, laying out the case with the precision of someone who had lived with the evidence for months. "This is not a case about a heat-of-the-moment mistake," she began, her voice steady. "This is about a decades-long conspiracy, about incest, about murder, about a mother willing to kill her own son in front of 200 witnesses to keep her secrets from being exposed." The jury listened, eyes flicking from Walters to Patricia, who sat beside her attorney without the slightest change in expression. When it was the defense's turn, Attorney Gregory Wells tried to reframe the narrative. "This is a tragic story," he said, pacing slowly. "Yes, my client fired that gun, but she did so in the grip of overwhelming fear. Fear of public humiliation, fear of losing the life she had built, fear of what would happen to her family if long-buried mistakes came to light." He leaned into the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, this was not premeditated murder. It was a breakdown, a mother's desperate, tragic act." The state's first witnesses were the crime scene investigators, who walked the jury through photographs of the church that day. The altar steps stained dark, the microphone lying in a crooked angle, Ethan's phone frozen on the DNA report. They introduced the wooden box itself, carefully sealed in evidence tape, and the letters inside, each one projected on the courtroom screen, the handwriting a perfect match to Patricia's and Marcus's. Then came Tiana, dressed in black, her voice barely above a whisper. She recounted the morning of the wedding, the joy she'd felt, the confusion when Ethan pulled the microphone, the instant the gunshot shattered everything. "He wanted to tell the truth," she said, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "He didn't want to start our marriage with lies. He told me that right before we left for the church. When asked if Ethan had seemed angry, she shook her head. Not angry, just determined." Next, the prosecution called Marcus Calloway. His appearance drew a visible reaction from the gallery. This was the man who had preached to them for years, now sitting under oath with shackles at his ankles. He admitted to the incest, admitted to knowing Patricia had killed David, admitted to helping her stage the death. "I thought I was protecting my family," he said, voice cracking. "But all I did was help destroy it." The cross-examination was brutal. The defense tried to paint Marcus as an unreliable witness, someone testifying only to cut his own prison time. But his admissions were corroborated by the physical evidence: the DNA results, the love letters, the altered birth certificate. The most damning moment came when the prosecution played a security camera clip from the church vestibule. Grainy but clear enough to show Patricia sliding her hand into her clutch and curling her fingers around the handgun seconds before she stood up to fire. Walters paused the footage, letting the image hang on the screen. "This," she told the jury, "is not the act of someone overwhelmed in a single moment. This is the act of someone who planned for this possibility." Throughout the testimony, Patricia rarely moved. Occasionally, she jotted notes for her attorney, but she never broke down, never teared up, not even when the coroner testified that Ethan died within seconds of the bullet tearing through his chest. Closing arguments brought the tension to a boil. Walters paced in front of the jury box, her voice sharp. She had 30 years to make different choices. 30 years to tell the truth. Instead, she chose lies, and when those lies were threatened, she chose violence. This was cold-blooded murder, committed in the house of God, in front of the man's fiancée, in front of her own congregation. The defense leaned hard on emotion. Wells reminded the jury that Patricia was 60 years old, with no prior convictions, a pillar of her community. "You have to decide," he said softly, "if you believe she woke up that morning intending to kill her son, or if this was the terrible, irreversible mistake of a desperate mother." The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was clear, guilty on all counts. First-degree murder for Ethan's death. First-degree murder for the 2005 killing of David Calloway. No possibility of parole. Patricia didn't flinch when the verdict was read. She stood as the judge pronounced her sentence, her gaze steady, almost defiant. In the gallery, a sob broke from Tiana, quickly muffled by the hand of a friend. As deputies led Patricia away, cameras outside the courthouse captured her last public image. Head held high, wrists bound, the roar of the crowd, some jeering, some silent, swelling behind her. For Fort Worth, the trial was over. But the story of the Calloway family had just been carved into the city's history, a cautionary tale about secrets, sin, and the moment they finally, violently, come to light. Winter came early to Fort Worth that year, the kind of cold that sharpened the air and made the courthouse steps slick with frost in the mornings. By the time Patricia Calloway was transferred to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Mountain View Unit, a maximum security facility for women, her name had become a byword for betrayal. The newspapers had moved on to fresher headlines, but the wound she left behind in her family and community hadn't begun to close. Inside prison walls, Patricia kept the same rigid composure she had in court. She didn't cry in the intake line. She didn't complain about the scratchy uniform or the bare cell. Other inmates whispered about her, the mother who shot her son at his wedding, but she rarely engaged. In the recreation yard, she walked the perimeter in slow, deliberate circles, as if each lap were another layer between herself and the memory of the church, the gun, the gasps. Marcus began serving his 12-year sentence at a medium security facility downstate. The man who once filled a pulpit every Sunday now kept mostly to himself, working in a library and avoiding chapel services entirely. Even among inmates hardened by their own crimes, the label of incest carried a particular weight. He spent most days reading, writing letters no one answered, his once commanding voice reduced to a quiet rasp. For Tiana, The months after the trial were a blur of grief and paperwork. She sold the engagement ring Ethan had given her, not out of anger, but because she couldn't bear to open the velvet box and see it glint in the light. The money went toward a memorial scholarship in Ethan's name for local students pursuing careers in real estate. She left Fort Worth altogether, moving to Austin, where no one would recognize her in the grocery store and whisper about the bride who watched her groom die. In the city, the church where the shooting happened sat empty for a time. The congregation fractured. Some followed a new pastor to a different building. Others abandoned organized religion entirely. The sanctuary was eventually stripped of its pews and stained glass, the altar removed. A developer bought the property, but the deal fell through when rumors spread about the building's history. Even after a fresh coat of paint, locals called it the wedding church, in the same hushed tone used for haunted houses. Detective Laura Martinez, who had led the investigation, kept a single photograph from the case on the corkboard above her desk. Not of the crime scene, but of the wooden box sitting on the evidence table. To her, it was the real murder weapon. Not the gun, not the rope from 2005, but the container that had held 30 years of rot until it finally split open. She used it as a reminder during every new case. Secrets don't stay buried forever. In the Calloway family cemetery, Ethan's grave sat between the marker for David Calloway and an empty plot reserved for Patricia. Some said that was cruel. Others said it was fitting that in death, just as in life, they'd never be far from each other. Visitors left flowers, sometimes wedding programs from other couples' ceremonies, a bittersweet gesture meant to honor what Ethan never got to finish. The story lingered in Fort Worth's collective memory, resurfacing whenever someone mentioned family scandals or the lengths people will go to protect a lie. It became a cautionary tale told in living rooms and barber shops, in whispered warnings to keep your house in order before the truth finds its way out. Years later, a true crime documentary crew came to town, interviewing those who had been there that day. Footage of Tiana's trembling voice, Marcus's downcast eyes, and Patricia's unwavering stare in court played alongside slow pans of the abandoned church. Viewers across the country watched, horrified and fascinated in equal measure, sending the story ricocheting across social media once more. By then, Patricia had been in prison long enough for her hair to turn completely white. She agreed to one interview for the documentary, sitting across from the camera in the visitation room. When asked if she regretted what she'd done, she paused, looked directly into the lens, and said, "I regret that he didn't understand." That's all. For the people who had loved Ethan, those words cut deeper than the gunshot ever had. They confirmed what many already believed. Patricia's prison was made of concrete and razor wire, but the real one had been built inside her long before the wedding day. And in Fort Worth, on certain September mornings when the air is warm and the light falls just right, some swear you can still hear the faint echo of a string quartet playing in the distance, cut short by a sound that changed everything.